Hello, we're back for another episode of Uncanny Oddities. Tonight we're going to be talking about tulpas and ghosts. So let's start off with tulpas. Now, I don't know how old you are out there, but there is a bit of an older movie called Harvey, like black and white era. Pretty old compared to my era. But anyways, so there's an old movie called Harvey. It is about this man and it's kind of like an uppity people, in a rich society type area, and they're not very happy with their brother because you see, he has an imaginary friend named Harvey, a 6 foot tall rabbit. He tells everyone it's a polka, and he says that this rabbit is 6 feet tall. He calls him Harvey, and they hang out all the time. He loves Harvey. Harvey is his best friend. And long story short, a puka is actually a demon. It's a trickster demon, according to the lore. But, anyways, that's unimportant to the story. Just an interesting side note. So, anyways, they're very upset with him because he's ruining their party, and they're worried that all the neighbors are going to be like, oh no, they have a crazy brother. Let's not go near them. So, they get upset one day, and, they have him committed to the local asylum, unfortunately. And long story short, he goes through all this stuff, and they're filling out the paperwork to have him committed, blah blah blah. And as he's walking out, uh Harvey, the imaginary friend who he insists is real, the puka, actually grabs the coat and takes a hat off the hat rack and places it on his head. So that was really awesome how they did that at the end, and I like that. But if you know the play or movie, I feel like that is a really good example of a tulpa. Now, there's another story, because tulpas are actually from ancient Tibetan monks. There's a story about a bunch of ancient Tibetan monks who sat around in a circle. I believe it was 30 of them, and they just focused their thoughts and energies. And over time, they were eventually able to bring a clay golem to life just by sitting there and focusing all their thoughts on it. And so what they did is, after they did all that, they focused their thoughts and brought the clay golem to life. And when they got done doing that, they focused their energy. It took 30 of them. They brought it to life just thinking about it. Like, I don't know what else to say about it. It's very impressive. It's actually pretty amazing. So, anyways, after that, uh, the main idea, let's go back. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the main idea is basically, once you get the idea of what you want to create, you think about it, and you can actually create a real entity just with enough mental focus and thought over a long enough period of time. By a long enough period of time, I mean literally hundreds and hundreds of hours of like pure intense focus. Like, you got to work hard for this, but it is possible. And so let's go ahead and start with the story of Slender Man. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard about Slender Man, the white creature with no face, creepypasta. So what's really interesting is Slender Man has been seen in public. People always talk about seeing him in public here and there and all that. And it spread like wildfire when it first came out, when it first released on creepypasta websites. So what it was is, it's this really tall man, like 6 or 7 feet, and they don't have a face, but they're wearing a black suit with a red tie. And they walk around, and they're really tall, and they scare people because, like, it doesn't have a face. So of course it's going to be scary. And what happened is, the one time, these children, I think they were about 12 to 14 years old, they went out and they said that they were going to try to get into Slenderman's mansion. They thought one of the children was somehow convinced that if she murdered the other two children, then she could gain entrance into Slenderman's mansion. It was human sacrifice, essentially. And so that was kind of twisted, you know? But this is a real story. This actually happened, and she actually ended up in the mental institution. And she recently got out. That's a whole other thing. But it the reason I mention this as a tulpa is just because of the pure intense belief that so many people have that this creature is real. It is actually possible to create something simply from your thoughts. Because regardless of whether Slenderman is real or not, the thought of Slenderman did end up creating a monster when that little girl stabbed the other two. So that's another interesting story of a tulpa. But tulpas are not always violent. As we mentioned earlier with Harvey, they can sometimes be helpful. Harvey was very helpful and very kind to his human friend that created him. But that's why you have to be careful when making tulpas, is because sometimes they can get out of hand, they can get out of control, and you always have to remember a tulpa is its own thought form, which means it has its own thoughts, its own likes, dislikes, interests, disinterests, all that good stuff. So these are very important things to keep in mind when discussing tulpas, because if you try to control a tulpa, it is much more likely to get upset and try to develop a mind of its own, like go against you. So you have to respect the tulpa and try not to demand things, but ask things and ask it questions. A lot of people will sometimes use tulpas as just a conversational partner when they get lonely sometimes. That's a common thing that people have done. And there are other areas of tulpas, and I'm sure you've heard of other areas of tulpamancy, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not even going to mention those other than saying that they exist. Because some of it gets kind of weird, and I'm not trying to talk about that. I'm trying to stick to the interesting parts that are not weird. So let's go ahead and discuss how to create a tulpa. Yes, I said it's, intense focus and thoughts, but there's more than that. Another important aspect of creating a tulpa is to have a sigil. And what you do is you put the sigil on a piece of paper, a rock, some wood, whatever feels sacred to you. You draw your sigil on whatever. I'll say a piece of paper in this example, okay? And then you put it in a place that feels central to your life, but also private. And when you do this, you stare at the symbol or sigil, you stare at it, and you just think about your tulpa. You need to give it an archetype. Is it going to be a protector, a teacher? Is it going to be like a guardian, a guider, someone who guides you? What kind of tulpa do you think you're trying to create here? And then you get the sigil, you stare at the sigil thinking about your tulpa, and you give it a name. And then you have to feed it thoughts and energy, and you have to let the tulpa become. You have to let it exist, and you have to believe in it. Believing in it is key. And when you do, just think, okay, what do you like? What's your favorite color? What kind of foods do you like? Not you as the person, but as the tulpa. Ask your tulpa these questions and wait for a response. The response may not always come in words. Sometimes it may come in resonance. You may just feel the reply in here, inside somewhere. You may just feel the reply. And then once you get all this done, you do this for hundreds and hundreds of hours, and you just have to feed it thoughts. And it works best if you put yourself within a circle or a triangle of candles, rocks, stones, or salt. Those are some of the most common, but truly anything which feels sacred to you personally will work. It's about resonance more than and ritual more than the actual object itself. And once you've done all this throughout hundreds and hundreds of hours, and I do mean decades, like most, even ancient Tibetan monks will study this and research this topic for multiple decades before even they attempt to do something like this. And as I said earlier, sometimes tulpas can gain a mind of their own. They can become unstable. So if you do something like this, you have to be extremely careful. And you can't do it unless you're in a proper mental area. I'm just going to leave it at that because it requires a lot of mental clarity. And anything that is going on in your head could affect the tulpa which you create. Now, let's go over to ghosts. Because a tulpa is an imaginary friend, essentially. So, could a ghost also be an imaginary friend? Are ghosts real or false? That is a question that has been up for debate for a long time. If ghosts are even real. So, what we tend to believe here at this Uncanny Earth, I think we can all agree on this one. And, because we've discussed ghosts on the show before. And I think we're all open to the possibility that they might be frequencies. Ghosts, death echoes, the loops. If you know anything about occultism and all that, you've probably been made aware of death echoes, which are when a ghost dies a particularly violent or gruesome death. Sometimes they can be left on what is known as a death echo, where they just are forced to live the moment of their death over and over for all eternity on an endless loop. And it's a really sad way for a ghost to end up. Now, you know about vengeful spirits. They typically die a gruesome death, typically involving murder. And then what they do is they like to come back and try to get revenge on those who killed them or wronged them or whatever. Now, one thing that's interesting is ghosts can speak over the radio, right? EVP, electronic voice phenomena. So it's interesting to me that people use electronic devices and often radios to pick up the voices of ghosts because when they use radios specifically, they have to tune the radios to specific frequencies in order to pick up the voices. And I think a lot of it also has to do with energy because, when something happens that, involves the death of a person, it tends to put off a lot of, spiritual energy one way or another. Even peaceful death can still put off, a massive amount of spiritual energy just because death is involved. And so sometimes that's why these places get haunted. Not because they're necessarily spirits, not because they're not, but maybe it's just the energy of that person living out their life or living out their final moments, whichever it may be. Maybe it's just their energy going through the motions and trying to see what is going on. Like, it's hard to explain because, like, when we have ghosts, we tend to think of it as a person haunting us, like a dead person actively making decisions and trying to haunt people. But a lot of it can also be seen as activities that person had done in life. For example, if you think a house is haunted because an ashtray goes flying across the room and shatters against the wall, yeah, it's probably haunted. But maybe it's not a ghost literally throwing the ashtray across the room intentionally. Maybe it's the energy because the person used to be a smoker and maybe they got angry one time and threw an ashtray across the room. So maybe it's repeating history. I know it sounds kind of weird, but that's just one possible idea. And then you got the story there's one story I heard about these people who tried to summon a ghost. They literally tried to create a ghost from out of nothing. They just thought about it, and that's one thing I think kind of borders the line between ghost and tulpa, because ghosts and tulpas are very similar to me. Because would one thing that we've discussed a few times on the show before is if someone knew nothing about the history of a haunted location, would they still experience a haunting at that location? Like, how much of hauntings and ghost stories become self fulfilling prophecies when we think about them? But there is also some science that suggests that a soul weighs 21 grams. There was a movie called 21 Grams where they supposedly weighed a soul. And this is complicated because I've heard contradictory things about this. I've researched this dozens of times and I cannot come to a real conclusion one way or the other if this is real or just a Hollywood movie. But my understanding from everything I've researched, I believe that this was real science, a real experiment that actually happened, and then they made a Hollywood movie about it, and then they tried to say, oh, it's just a Hollywood movie. Don't pay attention. Yeah, that's not real. But anyways, the story was they did an experiment and they had multiple people who were already, close to dying, and they put them on these gurneys, these weight tables, these tables that had weights on them, okay? And when they passed away at the exact moment of their death, and yes, they did account for the difference in the weight of voiding their bowels. They did account for that weight. And when they took out that weight, they found a difference of 21 grams, and thus they decided that a human soul weighs 21 grams. And according to science, matter can be neither created nor destroyed, the law of conservation of energy and mass. So that basically says that when we die, we transform. We don't ever die. Humans, according to science, are technically immortal because matter, hi, I'm matter, physical objects right here, see, physical objects can be neither created nor destroyed. It can only change form. So nothing has ever died. Truly, it has changed form, become a different type of energy. Because at the end of the day, what we have to understand is we are not this physical body. The physical body is simply a vessel for the energy, which is what we are. Our call it a soul, call it electric universe theory, whatever you want to call it. The thing powering our body is who we are. The body is simply a vessel, but the important part is the thing that powers it, the energy from within that makes it all work. In a car, you use gas. In an electric car, you use electricity. In a human body, you use a soul, spiritual energy, chakra, whatever you want to call it. That's what you use. And that's how you power this body that we go through life in. And yes, some of these bodies are incredibly brittle, frail, and weak. But that's all the more reason to work hard throughout your life so that you can understand how to advance into higher dimensions and advance in your growth. So that way, once you lose access to your body, once you're kicked out of the body and the body starts to decay, the more knowledge that you have at the end of your life, I believe the more likely you are to understand how to navigate the quote unquote spirit world. And of course, there are actually some movies that kind of dig into that a little bit in horror movies. That is a popular topic, the spirit world. And some people say you enter through the mirror. Some people say you can enter through closets, television sets. All sorts of different things have been presented as entrances to the spirit world over the years in horror movies. But once you get there, it can be very interesting because some horror movies actually present the spirit world as basically a shadowy, foggy area, very similar to our world, but with a lot more fog and a lot more darkness. And other shows have presented the spirit world as the exact same as ours right here with us. We just can't see them. But there's some interesting interpretations of ghosts, spirits, tulpas, and all this. So these have been my thoughts on tulpas and ghosts. So thank you all for coming to hang out, and we will see you next time. And as always, stay uncanny.